Hey everyone. Today I'm going to be discussing mental illness and the importance of looking after your mental health. Now, before I start, if some of you are looking at me and thinking, why is someone so young talking about such an important and unfortunately stigmatized topic? And you're right. I shouldn't be the person giving this talk here today. It should be my dad. I had this vision that once my dad had gotten over his severe depression and anxiety, that he could be a source of inspiration and guidance for people throughout the world. He was an incredible public speaker. He was very kind, friendly, funny, personable, and above all, he had a beautiful heart, and he would impact everyone that came into his life. Unfortunately, last year, about midway through last year, after dealing with mental illness and struggling with specifically depression and anxiety for so long, my dad made the decision to end his own life. And do you know what the tragedy is? And this is the reason I go around to schools all throughout Queensland. The tragedy is that Dad is just one of millions of people that suffer from mental illness every year. So there's a picture of my dad. Now, this I find is a tragedy. Did you guys know, and this is very alarming, did you guys know that by 2020, mental illness, specifically depression, will be the most common illness in the world and the second leading cause of death? Did you guys know that depression is doubling every 10 years? In fact, I'd like to draw your attention to the graph over here. As you can see, the green line, it represents the generation of our grandparents. And as you can see, in their whole entire life, they have a 10% chance of having depression at least once. Now, each of these lines shows each successive generation. Now, what I want to draw your attention to, and the really alarming statistic, is if you have a look at the red line, that's our current generation Y. Now, if you look at it here, by the time that most people in Generation Y are 20, 25% of them would have experienced depression of some kind throughout their life. And do you know what the alarming thing is? If we extrapolate that line, by the time people in Generation Y reach middle age, 50% will have had depression at one point in their life. And I just think this is alarming. I think this is a real tragedy, because after watching what my dad went through and the torment that mental illness entails to both himself and his family, although these are just statistics and numbers, there's a person behind each one of these statistics, just like my dad. And the fact that the rates of mental illness are increasing so rapidly is, I think, that's something that society really needs to stop and consider. And I've asked myself this question as well. Why? Why are so many people getting a mental illness? Why is it increasing? I mean, we are more technologically and medically advanced than we've ever been before. I think we can all agree on that. And antidepressant use medication has actually increased by 300% in the last 20 years. I read a statistic recently that 1 in 9 Americans is currently taking an antidepressive medication. So we are more medically and technologically advanced than ever before, and yet if you look at this graph, you can see that the rates of depression and mental illness are increasing from generation to generation. And how can this be? Well, the answer is actually quite simple. The lifestyles we are leading go against and are not in tune with how we have biologically evolved to live. Do you know 99.8% of human existence on Earth has been as hunter-gatherers? So that basically meant that the men would go out and hunt for game, and the women would often go and collect berries and fruits. And that's how we spent 99.8% of our human existence. It's only in the last 50 to 100 years that all this technology has come into our lives. So what this means is that we as humans are still biologically adapted to this hunter-gatherer lifestyle. It takes thousands of years for humans to actually adapt to something, especially the significant changes that have occurred over the last 50 to 100 years. It takes thousands of years. And so what this means is that our brains and bodies are still genetically and biologically adapted to live the lifestyle of a hunter-gatherer. So you might be wondering, what is the lifestyle of the hunter-gatherer? Well, basically, they were outside all day. They would be in tribes, small tribes that would be full of friends and family, so always surrounded by loved ones. Stresses were dealt with as a collective. That's a big one. It wasn't a competitive environment. The tribe either succeeded or didn't succeed, but it was one collective unit. They would have long and restful sleeps. Because they didn't have technology, they would often have 10, 11-hour sleeps. They ate healthy. And above all, and this is the most important one, the fight or flight, or the stress response, was only triggered in short bursts of maybe like 30 seconds to a minute. So the fight or flight response is basically, if they saw a predator coming at them, say an elephant was charging at them, they'd either fight the elephant, or run away. And the fight or flight, that's how the fight or flight response evolved. So what it does is it actually triggers all these hormones and puts them into our bloodstream. So adrenaline's triggered. There's about 29 different hormones that are triggered during the fight or flight response. And what it did is it prepared our body for intense physical activity. That's what it did. It ensured that we could either fight the predator or run away. And the most important thing about it is that in the short term, it's adaptive. We can deal with it. But in the long term, the fight or flight response, if triggered for long periods of time, is toxic. Now, if we look at our own lifestyle and actually compare it to the hunter-gatherer way of living, you'll see that we're sedentary. Majority of our lives are actually spent indoors. We're more socially isolated than ever before. People are trading FaceTime for Facebook. We eat fast food laden diets. We're not out in the sun as much. Basically, the lifestyles we're currently leading go directly against how we are meant to be living them. And the result of this is an epidemic of depressive illness. Now, if you want evidence of this, you'll find this very interesting. The Kululi tribe, they're one of the last remaining hunter-gatherer tribes throughout the world. So they have no technology, and they live in the highlands of Papua New Guinea. And some researchers actually went there, some of the first Westerners that have gone and seen the Kululi tribe. And out of 3,000 people, not one person was found to have a mental illness. And yet if you took that same 3,000 people from the Australian populace, 400 would have a mental illness. And that's a direct result of this mismatch between the lifestyles we are leading and the lifestyles we should be leading, and the lifestyles that we are biologically meant to be leading. Now, the good news is that we can change this. We can rectify this problem. It's quite simple. It's really quite simple. All we need to do is implement simple lifestyle changes that ensure that our lifestyles are now more in tune with the hunter-gatherer way of living. So, I'm just going to go through there's 8 steps or tips that I normally give when I go around to these schools and present. And these 8 tips have been actually proven to significantly reduce by about 80% your chance of getting a mental illness and significantly improve your mental health. So the 8 lifestyle changes. Now, I don't have much time here today, so I'm not going to be able to go through all of them, but I'm just going to focus on what I believe are the 2 most important ones. Now, the first one is to reduce and manage stress. Now, this is incredibly important because this is what triggers the fight or flight response. And when the fight or flight response is triggered for long periods of time, that's when neurochemical change occurs. And that's when mental illness occurs. And that's unfortunately what happened to my dad. He was working incredibly hard, about 18, 19-hour days for about 4 to 5 years, to the extent where he had a bed in his office and to ensure that he kept working. And it was that high level of stress that he put himself under that resulted in these neurochemical changes in the brain and resulted in him getting severe depression and anxiety. So the most important one is to reduce and manage stress. And I really want to stress this one because in today's day and age, everyone's so caught up. Everyone's so caught up by achievement, by getting money, by getting fame. And what happens is that people neglect their mental health. They neglect their mental health because they put themselves under so much stress. And stress is probably the biggest cause of depression. So some advice on this, what I tell the students when I go around and give talks, is you've got to put things in perspective. And you've got to manage your stress. You've got to notice when you are feeling too stressed, when things are starting to build up. And then you've got to make some changes. So some really good pieces of advice is that exercise has been found to be one of the best stress-reducing things that you can do for yourself. Playing music, having a conversation with someone is actually really beneficial as well. Lots of different activities. Everyone has their own stress release. And it's when you recognize that you are starting to get stress that you should implement these. Now, stress is fine. Stress is fine in small, short doses. Our bodies can deal with that. But it's when it's prolonged for weeks, months. It's when we're feeling stressed about a job interview 3 weeks before the job interview, or stressed 3 weeks after when we haven't heard about our result from the job interview. That's when it becomes too much. So in short doses, it's okay. But if you start to notice that you're feeling and you're putting yourself under a lot of stress for a prolonged period of time, that's when you've got to make changes. That's when you've got to look at your life and realize, how can I reduce my stress levels? And everyone has their own ways of doing it, but exercise, music, reducing your workload, gaining perspective. I talk about this one a lot. If you're in an aeroplane, for example, there's no point being worried that you're going to crash or you're going to go missing or something. There's no point worrying about that because it's outside of your control. Once you've had a job interview, there's no point worrying about whether you're going to get it because it's outside of your control. When it's outside of your control, there's no point in putting undue stress on yourself. So the number one piece of advice I can give, if you're going to take anything away from this talk, is reduce and manage your levels of stress. The other piece of advice I like to give, it's number 8, but it's not showing up on there, and it's to seek help early. Now, my dad was by far the strongest person I've ever met, by far. He'd run several large successful companies, an incredible hard worker. He was always so athletic. And even he got mental illness. Often the most successful people can get a mental illness because they try so hard to succeed and they put themselves under so much stress. And unfortunately, in this day and age, there's still a stigma attached to mental illness. And yet it'll soon be the most common illness in the world. You'll often hear people talking about cancer or other illnesses. But unfortunately, mental illness is often neglected. And it's very unfortunate because people feel that they are weaker if they have a mental illness. They feel that they can't go and express and tell someone if they've got a mental illness. They think it's a bad thing. They think it's a bad thing and it shows a bad, weak side of their persona. But that's not the case, and that needs to change. There's so much help available out there now with Beyond Blue, Black Dog Institute, Lifeline. There's all these numbers you can call. You can see a psychologist. You can talk to a friend, talk to a family member. There is so much help out there. And yet a lot of people are too proud or too affected by the stigma associated to mental illness to go and seek this help. So if I had to give you 2 pieces of advice, there's 8 on there, but the 2 that I would really stress is reducing your stress and managing it. And then on the other hand, if you've noticed you're beginning to feel down, if you're noticing symptoms, then going and seeking help. I would absolutely love if you guys could all implement these 8 lifestyle changes into your lives. Because it does make a huge difference. They've done studies in America, and they did it on people with depression, and 78% of people, by implementing these 8 steps, taking no medication, 78% of people with depression are feeling much better. And that's people with depression. And these steps should be implemented by everyone, no matter whether you've got a mental illness or not. Because not only does it improve your mental health, but it decreases your chances of getting a mental illness. So I've actually started a charity over the last couple of months and built a website which is going live in about 3 or 4 days. And the charity is called Breaking Free. And I understand that there's a lot of information I wasn't able to go over today with the 8 steps. But if you'd like to know more, you can actually go and search Breaking Free in probably 3 or 4 days once the site's live. And it's got information on each of the 8 steps. And I'd love if you guys could go to it and if you could really spread the message. Because that's what really needs to happen. A revolution really needs to happen when it comes to mental health. Because whereas other illnesses are going down, mental illness is increasing. And there is nothing worse than having an illness which prevents you from doing the things that you need to do to get better. I don't know any other illness like it. Where you should be talking to people, where you should be exercising, where you should be getting out there and trying new things. But it makes you feel like not doing that. And that's an awful illness. And that's why we really need to spread, and I really want to spread this message of how implementing 8 simple steps can reduce your chances of getting mental illness and improve your mental health. So please spread the message. Tell everyone you know about the 8 steps. Because in today's society, everyone's hung up about how they look, their success, what they've achieved. But people are failing to look after their mental health. And I think looking after your mental health is an idea very much worth sharing. And I'd just like to finish my presentation by saying what my dad would say if he was still here. And that's, please look after your mental health. It's the most important thing you have. Thank you.